Journalist, activist, and artist Sonali Kolhatkar is the founder, host, and executive producer of Pacifica Radio's popular morning drive time program, Uprising with Sonali, which airs on KPFK and KPFA, and also as a TV show on Free Speech Television. She's a weekly columnist at Truthdig and writes for Telesur English. She is also the founding co-director, of the Afghan Women's Mission, a US-based nonprofit solidarity organization that funds the work of RAWA. She is the author as well of Bleeding Afghanistan, Washington Warlords, and the Propaganda of Silence.
Actually, I started my journalistic career in 2003. So actually, no, 2002, I'm sorry. So it was just about a year before the war on Iraq began. And I remember it was a very exciting moment to be a journalist. It was also a very, heartbreaking moment to be an American. Although at that time I wasn't yet a citizen, but I'd lived in the country long enough. And I remember as a Pacifica journalist feeling particularly happy that I was in a network that, unlike the major media, was very clearly pointing out that we were being all lied to by the president, by the cabinet, by Colin Powell. I actually co-hosted a national broadcast organized by Pacifica when Colin Powell made his infamous speech to the United Nations, giving, quote, clear definitive evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And despite the really obvious lies around the pretext to the Iraq war, that war went ahead. And as it felt particularly satisfying and gratifying to have, only a few months later, when the US went into Iraq and found that there were no weapons of mass destruction, to be in that minority of journalists in the United States who were saying, this is just not true. The Saddam Hussein is not planning to carry out attacks on us imminently. He is not amassing a massive arsenal of weapons. Of course, it was extremely sad to see us sad to see the fact that we were in a minority, and we meaning independent journalists were in a minority. The other thing that I remember being so excited to witness and report on as a journalist were the huge anti-war marches. Of course, we remember in February 2003 the massive anti-war marches that took place against the war in Iraq. It was important to document that because the mainstream media really wasn't interested in seeing that sort of dissent against the Iraq war, because the Iraq war was so much for some reason, the war against Iraq was much more opposed than the war in Afghanistan. Americans, I think, wrongly felt that the war in Afghanistan was justified because of the September 11th attacks, but that the Iraq war had nothing to do with September 11th. And so there was much more outrage about that war, and covering that was amazing. But then, of course, the long, dark years of the Iraq war were also very interesting to cover as a journalist, because there would be so many moments when the media would simply move away from what was happening in Iraq, move away from what was happening in Afghanistan, just move away from, once Saddam Hussein particularly was deposed and once he was killed, it was as though our job there was done. But our troops were still there. Our troops were still fighting. Our troops were still causing chaos. Our policies to basically dismantle Saddam Hussein's forces that became so disgruntled that ended up fueling a civil war of sorts in Iraq. Those stories were something that myself as an independent journalist felt absolutely compelled to keep covering, and we've continued to cover that. And I also remember as an independent journalist how important it was to seek out voices of dissent inside Iraq. So we really sought out women's voices from inside Iraq, Iraqi women living here in the United States who had relatives in Iraq and who were, watching the war and its consequences unfold bit by bit. And so those voices were extremely important. Meanwhile, on CNN, all you had were the military generals. All you had were the war strategists who would try to determine whether a particular battle would succeed or not, rather than whether we ought to be there in the first place. There were so many amazing independent films and documentaries. The war in Iraq, I think, really was one of those moments where documentary filmmaking blossomed. You know, we had like Robert Greenwald's incredible films, so many fantastic films that came out about what was actually happening in Iraq, and documentary filmmakers, I think, really found a footing here in the United States, with the Iraq War becoming a very big focus. And so we focused on that as well, you know, that independent journalists and documentary filmmakers were going to Iraq, and interviewing them became a really important part of how we covered that country. I really feel like one of the questions Americans don't ask ourselves often enough is put ourselves in the shoes of ordinary Iraqis. How would we feel if another country had come and, on a false pretext, and destroyed our government, such as it was, setting aside the fact that, you know, people were living under a dictatorship? You know, most Iraqis knew that the U.S. was not really interested in their well-being. And that came, of course, after years and years of sanctions by the Clinton administration that impoverished and starved Iraqis. How would we feel if we had bombs continually dropped on our heads? How would we feel if our relatives were humiliated in Abu Ghraib? I didn't even mention Abu Ghraib. The coverage of Abu Ghraib as a journalist and independent journalist was one of the most important tasks that I felt I had to uncover the humiliation at U.S. hands of ordinary Iraqis. All of those things have fueled the anger and the hatred against the United States among a surprisingly small minority of Iraqis. It's surprising that not more wish ill on us, because look at what we have done to them. And unless we take stock of that, we'll never be able to make sense of what's really happening in Iraq. And of course, that's a big part of the media's job, is to make sense of the world, to help put things in context, to give that historical perspective, to try to follow the money, to try to follow the interests, the corporate interests, the commercial interests, the private interests, the weapons manufacturers. And we don't get enough of that from the mainstream media. So it's been, you know, it's been frustrating and gratifying as a journalist, independent journalist covering Iraq. Frustrating because the answers have been so obvious if you simply look for them in terms of how, you know, things are going badly and what could be done to right them. And gratifying because it's always gratifying to be on the team that gets it right. You know, I wish the mainstream media had gotten it right, but they really haven't. You know, here and there, you get good facts, but the analysis is missing, the context is missing, and that's what's sorely needed.